Welcome to the second part of our three-part series on the Israeli M-50 Sherman tank. While the first part covered the development and production of the vehicle, this part will cover its extensive operational use. The first 25 M-50s arrived in Israel in mid-1956 and went to equip a company of the 27th Armored Brigade. This brigade also had two companies equipped with M1 Super Shermans, one half-tracked company equipped with M3 half-tracks, a motor infantry battalion, and a light reconnaissance battalion with AMX 1375 tanks. The first use of the M50 Sherman was between 29 October and 7 November 1956 during the Suez Crisis. The 27th Armored Brigade was sent into the Sinai Desert to engage the Egyptian forces. The Israeli attack took the Egyptian army by surprise. The Egyptians were counting on the fortifications erected in the Sinai Desert to defend the roads that crossed the peninsula. The Israeli Shermans and AMX light tanks fought with excellent results against the Egyptians, which had a huge variety of armor consisting of T-34-85s, self-propelled 17-pounder Archers, Sherman Fireflies, Sherman M4A4s refitted with a GM twin 671 375 horsepower diesel engine of the M4A2 and M4A4 FL10s. This last version, produced by France for the Egyptian army, had the AMX 1375 turret, equaling the firepower of the M50 while also keeping the autoloader. The Israelis lost a few armored vehicles and captured many Egyptian depots and military bases. They took possession of about a dozen M4A4 FL10s and many other M4A4 Shermans that were transferred to Israel, converted, and put into service as standard M4A4 Shermans or M50s. Between 1956 and 1967, there were many border skirmishes between Israel and its Arab neighbors. During one of these, on 6 March 1964, Major General Israel Talik Tal was aboard his M50 Sherman along with a Centurion tank. They spotted 8 Syrian tractors at about 2,000 meter distance, and in 2 minutes, Tal claimed 5 of the 8 tractors destroyed by his Sherman. The other 3 were knocked out by the Centurion. Some days later, another Sherman destroyed an Egyptian recoilless rifle at a distance of 1,500 meters. The second and biggest use of the M50 was between 5th and 10th of June 1967 in the Six-Day War. At that time, the Israeli armored force was mostly relying on the M48 A2C2, M48 A3 Patton, and Centurion Mark V, a part of which were rearmed with the 105mm Royal Ordnance L7 cannons, increasing anti-tank performance. About 100 M50 Shermans were sent into the desert to take part in the offensive in Sinai. Another 100 was sent to the north to take part in the offensive on the Golan Heights, while the rest remained in reserve. In Jerusalem, very few M50 Shermans fought because of the need for their offensive power on other fronts of the war, preferring to use the old M1 Sherman armed with the old US 76mm cannons in the clashes against the Jordanians in the city. At least 3 M50 Shermans supported infantry assaults on Ammunition Hill, and the day after the final attack on Jerusalem's Old City, with no M1s lost in combat and only 1 M50 Sherman destroyed. The Sinai offensive was launched at 8 a.m. on 5th June 1967. The M50 and M51 Shermans played a marginal role against the Egyptian tanks. One of these engagements was during the Battle of Abu Aguila, a stronghold that controlled the road to Ismailia. Consisting of 3 lines of trenches 5 kilometers long and almost 1 kilometer apart, they were defended by T-34-85s and T-54 tanks present in hull-down positions. Soviet 130mm cannons were placed in Katif, a nearby hill, and the Egyptian reserves included an armored regiment consisting of 66 T-34-85s and a battalion with 22 SD-100s or Su-100Ms. These were two versions of the Su-100 Soviet tank destroyer. The former was produced after the Second World War by Czechoslovakia, while the latter was a version modified by the Egyptians and Syrians to better adapt the SD and Su-100 to desert operations. About 150 Israeli tanks were employed. The 14th Armored Brigade had over 60 M-50 and M-51 Shermans. The 63rd Armored Battalion had over 60 Centurion Mark V tanks, while the Divisional Mechanized Reconnaissance Battalion had an unknown but limited number of AMX-13s. The Israeli attack was launched at night, under the cover of darkness. Number 124 Paratroopers Squadron attacked and destroyed the cannons on Katef Hill, as the 14th Armored Brigade Sherman tanks advanced hidden and covered by the dark and an artillery barrage that was hitting the Egyptian trenches. The infantry, supported by M3 half-tracks, cleaned up the trenches, while the Shermans, after breaking through, supported the Centurions, which had outflanked the Egyptian positions, by intercepting the reserves that advanced for the counterattack. During the battle fought between 4 a.m. and 7 a.m., the Egyptians lost over 60 tanks and 2,000 soldiers, while the Israelis only lost 19 tanks, 8 during the battle, while the other 11 were Centurions damaged in the minefields, with a total of 7 crewmen and 40 soldiers dying during the attack. When Egyptian Field Marshal Mohammed Amer learned of the defeat of Abu Aguila, he ordered his soldiers to withdraw to Gidi and Mitla, just 30 kilometers from the Suez Canal. The order to withdraw was received by almost all Egyptian units, which retreated in a disorganized manner to Suez, often abandoning fully functional weapons, cannons, or tanks in their defensive positions. In the afternoon of the 6th of June, with the arrival of materials such as MiG fighters and tanks from Algeria, the withdrawal order was cancelled, creating even more confusion in the troops that, except in rare cases, continued to retreat to Suez. Sensing the situation, the Israeli High Command ordered that access to the Suez Canal be blocked by trapping most of the Egyptian army in Sinai. Due to the rapid advance of those days, many Israeli tanks were left with little fuel and ammunition. For this reason, not all Israeli forces were able to move immediately towards the canal. To give an idea of this problem, the road to Ismailia was blocked only by 12 Centurions of the 31st Armored Division, which had at least 35 other Centurions with empty fuel tanks. Another example is that of Lieutenant Colonel Zev Eitan, commander of the 19th Light Tank Battalion equipped with AMX 1375 light tanks. Since his vehicles had full tanks, he was given the task of stopping an enemy attack with his reconnaissance light tanks. Eitan left with 15 AMX-13s and positioned himself in the dunes near Bir Girgafa, waiting for the enemy. The Egyptian counterattack, with 50 or 60 T-54s and T-55s, forced the AMX-13s to retreat after suffering many losses without destroying a single Egyptian tank. The 19th Light Tank Battalion, however, slowed down the Egyptians long enough for some M50s and M51s to fill up with fuel and intervene in the area. By hitting the heavier vehicles on their sides, these managed to destroy many of them, forcing the others to retreat to Ismailia, on the road to which they encountered the other 12 Centurions, which totally destroyed them. In Sinai, the Egyptian army lost 700 tanks, of which 100 were captured intact by the Israelis, in addition to an unknown number which were repaired and put into service in the IDF in the following months. The Israelis lost 122 tanks, of which about a third were recovered and repaired after the war. The 10th Harel Mechanized Brigade, under Colonel Uri Ben Ari attacked the hills north of Jerusalem on the afternoon of June 5, 1967. Made up of 5 tank companies instead of the 3 standard ones, the 10th Brigade had 80 vehicles, 48 of which were M-50 Shermans, 16 were Panhard AML armored cars, and 16 were Centurion Mark Vs armed with old 20-pounder cannons. Their attack was thwarted by the rough terrain and mines scattered everywhere on the narrow streets of that region. The accompanying engineers had no mine detectors, and mines had to be found by probing the ground for hours with bayonets and submachine gun ramrods. On that day, 7 Shermans and an M3 half-track were damaged by mines and were left unoperational for the rest of the offensive. During the night, all 16 Centurions got stuck in rocks or damaged their tracks and could not be assisted or helped because of Jordanian artillery fire. Later that night, an assault by Israeli mechanized infantry destroyed the Jordanian artillery and, the next morning, repairs began. Only 6 M-50 Shermans, some M3 half-tracks, and a few Panhard AML armored cars arrived the next morning at their destination, but they were immediately greeted by Jordanian fire. 2 Jordanian armored companies arrived during the night, equipped with M48 Pattons, immediately putting a Sherman out of action. The remaining Shermans, with the assistance of others which arrived shortly after, outflanked the M48 Pattons, which were placed in fixed positions, and hit them in their sides, where their additional fuel tanks were placed. The additional fuel tanks the Pattons carried had not been dismounted as they should have, and became an easy target to hit. After a few minutes of fighting, 6 Jordanian M48 Pattons were on fire. The remaining tanks retreated to Jericho, abandoning another 11 M48s along the way because of mechanical failures. The Ugda Brigade, that fought further north, was equipped with 48 M50s and M51s, and had the task of defeating Jordanian positions in the Jordanian town of Janin, defended by 44 M47 Patton tanks and the 40th Armored Brigade in reserve with M47 and M48 tanks. After a very rapid advance throughout the day, during which Ugda forces also destroyed some artillery positions that were hitting Jerusalem and a crucial Israeli military airport, night fell and many Shermans ended stuck in the small mountain roads. 6 or 7 Sherman M50s and M51s climbed Burkim Hill. During the night of the 5th and 6th of June, among the olive groves, they found themselves face to face with an entire Jordanian armored company, armed with M47 Pattons less than 50 meters away. With the cover of darkness, Israeli tanks attacked the Jordanian forces, destroying more than a dozen tanks for only 1 knocked out M50 Sherman and no Israeli tank crew losses. The fighting in the area was bloody for several more days. The Jordanians resisted vigorously, counter-attacking Israeli forces with all their available tanks. Although the 90mm cannons of the M47 and M48 Patton were very effective against the Israeli Shermans, the crews operating them were not very well trained, especially in long-distance shooting. The Israelis, in addition to superior training, were able to count on almost unlimited air support that turned out to be, both during day and night, very effective. During the advance, an Israeli armored company had to face many M47s and M48s hidden in fixed positions. The Israelis decided to request air support, but a first wave of fighters did not find any targets because the Jordanian tanks were well camouflaged. A crew of an M-50 Sherman, rather recklessly, decided to launch at full speed towards the enemy positions. The Pattons immediately opened fire without hitting them once. The Sherman got close enough to hit a Patton, knocking it out, before turning around and returning to Israeli lines and rejoining its company. The smoke from the burning Patton, in addition to the accurate coordinates sent by an Israeli M3 half-track observer vehicle which had spotted all the Jordanian tanks, made it possible to precisely bomb all the paytons from the air and destroy them. In the end, in the last 2 days of the war, the commander of the Jordanian 40th Armored Brigade, Rakan Anad, staged a counterattack by hitting Israeli supply lines. At first, the attack launched on 2 different roads was quite successful, managing to destroy some M3 half-tracks that carried ammunition and fuel for the Israeli tanks. The Israelis, who expected the offensive, however, repelled the first attacks by the Jordanian Pathans. A small force composed of AMX-13s, 12 Centurions, and some Shermans of the 37th Israeli Armored Brigade went up a very narrow road, considered unusable by the Jordanians, and attacked the rear of the enemy forces by surprise. Commander Anad, along with his forces, were forced to retreat without being able to attempt any more attacks, abandoning another 35 M48 Patterns and an unknown number of M47 Patterns on the battlefield. Due to political problems, ground attacks on Syria were not immediately authorized by Defense Minister Moshe Dayan, even though General Albert Mendler's forces were sent to the border ready for battle. After much pressure from the villagers living in the area, fed up with the periodic Syrian bombing, and senior army officers, after a whole night of reflection, at 6 a.m. on 9th June 1967, Moshe Dayan authorized the attack on the Golan Heights. From 6 to 11 a.m., the Israeli Air Force bombarded Syrian positions relentlessly, while the army engineers sapped the streets from below. The advance of armored vehicles, mostly M50s, M51s, and M3 half-tracks, began at 11:30 a.m. Hundreds of vehicles lined the road behind a bulldozer. At the top of the road, at a crossroads, the forces of Colonel Aryeh Biro, commander of the column, split up. Divided into 2 columns, they attacked the Kala stronghold, a hill with 360-degree defenses, with bunkers and World War II anti-tank guns of Soviet origin. 6 kilometers north, the Zaura stronghold, another defensive hill, supported Kala with its artillery fire by obstructing Israeli vehicles and not allowing Biro's officers to see the battlefield. The situation confused several officers, who advanced toward Zaura convinced they were attacking Kala. The battle lasted over 3 hours, and the information available is very confusing, as many officers died or were injured during the battle or were evacuated. Lieutenant Horowitz, the officer who commanded the assault on Kala, continued to command while injured and with the radio system of his Sherman destroyed by a Syrian shell. During the approach, he lost many of the Shermans under his command. About 20 of them remained functional at the base of the hill. The climb to the top was hampered by dragon teeth, concrete anti-tank obstacles, and heavy artillery fire. In an interview after the war, Lieutenant Horowitz said that one of his M-50 Shermans, commanded by a certain Ilan, was hit by a Syrian anti-tank cannon and set in flames during the climb. Ilan and his crew jumped out of the tank, put out the flames which were burning them, and, after ordering his crew to find cover, Ilan climbed on the burning Sherman, turned the turret, hit the anti-tank gun that had knocked out his tank, and then jumped out of the tank and sought cover. Of the approximately 20 functional Shermans, most were hit by anti-tank guns, but the sturdy hull of the vehicle made it possible to recover and repair many after the battle. At 4 p.m., the stronghold of Zaura was occupied, while Kala was occupied only 2 hours later. Only 3 Shermans arrived at the top of the hill, including that of Horowitz, who easily overcame the barbed wire and the trenches, forcing the Syrian soldiers to escape after throwing hand grenades from the turrets of the tanks into the trenches. An hour after Aryeh Biro's attack, the Israeli 1st Golani Infantry Brigade climbed the same road and attacked the positions of Kibbutz, Tel Azaziat, and Tel Fakr that were hitting Israeli villages. Tel Azaziat was an isolated mound, 140 meters above the border, where 4 Syrian Panzer IV tanks in fixed positions constantly hit the Israeli plane below. The tank company of the 8th Armored Brigade, equipped with Sherman M50s, and the mechanized infantry company of the 51st Battalion, equipped with M3 half-tracks, attacked the positions and quickly managed to silence the cannons of the Syrian panzers, but this was not the case in Tel Fakr. Located 5 kilometers from the border, the two companies that attacked it, with 9 M-50 Shermans and 19 M3 half-tracks, made a wrong turn while under intense artillery fire. Instead of going around the enemy position, they ended up with all vehicles in the center of the fortifications, under heavy anti-tank fire and in the midst of minefields, which soon destroyed or knocked out all the vehicles. This forced the Israelis to attack the fortification with only infantry. At the end of the battle for the Golan Heights, the Israelis occupied all their targets, but lost a total of 160 tanks and 127 soldiers. Although many of the tanks were recovered after the war and repaired, returning to service a few months later, these losses were much higher than the 122 tanks lost in the Sinai offensive and the 112 lost in the Jordan offensive. On the Golan Heights, the M50s had no difficulty dealing with the Syrian T-34-85s and against the last Panzer IVs in use. However, the limitations were seen against the Jordanian M47 and M48 patterns and the Syrian and Egyptian T-54s and T-55s. It was shown that the CN-7550 cannon was no longer able to deal with the most modern tanks. After the war, the M-50 Sherman began to be taken out of active service, as it seemed that it would no longer be effective. Some may have been converted into 155mm self-propelled guns. On October 6, 1973, at the outbreak of the Yom Kippur War, the Israelis were caught unprepared by the Arab attack. They deployed all the available reserves, including 341 M51s and M50 Sherman Mark IIs still available. The M50 Mark Is had all either been brought to the Mark II standard or removed from the reserve and scrapped by January 1, 1972. At the outbreak of the war, on the Golan Heights front, the Israelis could count on 2 armored brigades with a total of 177 Shot-Kal tanks with 105mm L7 cannons, against 3 Syrian armored divisions with a total of 900 Soviet-made tanks, mostly T-54s and T-55s, with a few T-34-85s, Su-100s, and even more modern T-62s. On October 6th, a few hours after the beginning of the war, the 71st Battalion, composed of students and instructors of the IDF Armor School, a force of about 20 tanks including some M50s, was sent to the front line. On October 7th, the Syrians attacked the position held by the 77th OZ and 71st Battalion, trying to bypass the Israeli defenses. After several hours, in the afternoon, the Syrians were forced to give up their attack by withdrawing and leaving over 20 destroyed tanks on the battlefield. Around 10 p.m., the Syrian 7th Infantry Division and the 3rd Armored Division, which had night vision equipment, and also the 81st Armored Brigade equipped with the powerful T-62, attacked again. The Israelis, deploying a total of 40 tanks, were able to withstand 2 different waves of the 500 tanks of the Syrian army. During the second attack, at 4 a.m., the Syrian commander, General Omar Abrash, was killed when his command tank was hit by an Israeli shell. The loss of the general slowed down the offensive in that sector, which resumed only on October 9th. The Syrian tanks attacked the now exhausted Israeli soldiers of the 71st and 77th Battalions of the 7th Armor Brigade. After several hours of combat, the Israeli commander, Ben Gal, had only 7 tanks left that had managed to fire hundreds of shells thanks to the crews that, hiding among the rocks. Thank you for watching the second part of our 3-part series on the Israeli M-50 Sherman. This has covered the operational use of the vehicle. The next episode will cover the post-IDF upgrades, camouflage and markings, and some myths that need to be dispelled.